Beloved friends, on this first Sunday of Lent, the church always takes us back to the story of creation in the book of Genesis. And when we hear the familiar story, we are always tempted to think of it as a story of sin. And reading this story today seems to validate our assumption about sin. But what if sin is not the purpose of the story? In fact, the primary goal of that story is to establish the purpose for which God created the human person. And that is to know Him, to love Him, to serve Him, and through tilling and keeping the garden or the earth. This purpose is significant because many creation stories present the creation of man as a byproduct or an accident and a mistake of the gods. However, the Christian understanding of the story in Genesis chapter 2 is that God intended to create people precisely for a reason, before even sin, before shame, and before exile came. However, the story tells us that God formed the human person from the dust of the earth and breathed into him the breath of life. That image is essential for our Lenten journey. Humans are dust, finite, fragile, but are filled with God's own breath. And here lies the dignity of being human. Our lives are not self-made, they are received. In other words, we are not created for ourselves, but for God's given purpose to till the earth and to keep it. Notice that God sent human into the garden ultimately because the earth needed some care. And here lies the problem. Inasmuch as this mission is compelling, there is also distraction. The garden where the humans were created into was already full, and things there were pleasant to the sight and more so good for food. In the midst of caring, they are also distracted to eat fruits, even the forbidden one. Here comes the first temptation, which is distraction. The deceiver comes, not loud, not violent, but clever. And he asked, "Did God really say you should not eat of any of the trees in the garden?" Notice that the way the question is asked is intended to make the command of God unreasonable. And the devil added, "Listen, you shall not die. Rather, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God." Now, the temptation here begins not with rebellion, but with suspicion. God's generosity is reinterpreted as selfish restriction. With this new insight in the human mind, trust is replaced with doubt. The fruit that looks good for food, desirable and pleasing to the eyes, is now taken not in hunger, but in greed, to get more and to be like God. Their eyes are open, but what they see is not freedom. Instead, it is nakedness. This is a new regime, the beginning of destruction. And the consequence is that shame enters the world. Trust is broken, and humanity begins to hide from one another and from God. My dear friends, this story of mission and distraction is what begins the journey of Lent. Lent is not first about giving things up. Rather, it is about recovering trust. It is about confronting that ancient lie that God is holding something back from us. It is a time of penitence, of recognizing the ways we have let ourselves be distracted from God-given mission. This mission hasn't changed, however, despite our fall. That is why this Lent wishes to bring us back to God's call and to the right path, the path of our mission. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4 today, Matthew contradicts the feel-good and prosperity gospel preached in many of our modern Christian churches. Now, easy life is not the Christian call. In fact, the more Christian we become, the more we struggle with conflicts of loyalty. For Jesus, sonship was not a feel-good kind of life. In our text today, Jesus is led into the desert. In the Bible, the desert or wilderness is almost always a place of struggle and conflict of loyalty. However, where Adam fell in the garden of abundance, Christ stands firm in a place of hunger. Where they wanted more, Jesus stood firm on what God provided. Where Adam and Eve doubted God's honesty, Jesus entrusts himself completely to God. Thus he affirmed to the tempter one does not live on bread alone. My dear friends, temptation comes to us in moments when we look at others and feel insecure about not having enough. And temptation wins when we justify bad behaviors like lies, judgment of strangers, racist jokes, or bringing down others. Therefore, our Lenten invitation this year is to strive to pass from the garden of lost innocence to the desert of honest trust in God. The Lenten call is to fast, pray, and practice charity. And this is an invitation to see life as a gift, to trust God's voice through listening, and to loosen our grip on what we cling to for security. Remember that through the obedience of one man, many will be made righteous and free from guilt, fear, and insecurity that the devil wants us to feel. The good news is this Lent, God never withdraws his breath. Even after we fall, he seeks us out in our hiding place and asks, "Where are you?" Now is the season to stop hiding and allow yourself to be found. What is your answer to the question, "Where are you?" My dear friends, may this Lent bring us back from suspicion to trust, from shame to mercy, and fill us again with the breath of God. May God bless you.